Good morning to you. It is Friday, the 25th of March, the year of our Lord 2022, or something like that. Morning, George.
Good morning.
I was just realizing we've been doing this for 4 weeks now, how relaxed we're kind of getting to start the show. I saw it was 11 o'clock. I went, right, we're going live. Didn't check in, didn't do anything. And it is what it is now, isn't it? We just get into it and we talk and off we go.
Yeah, it's amazing how far we've come.
Oh, you could make a song about how far we've come. Some kind of anthem would sound good. Yeah, you're doing well. How you feeling? Everyone's wanting to know about how you're feeling. You were kind of feeling a bit sick at the beginning of the week. Have you had any more rat tests? So yeah, you're doing all right?
No, I should probably, maybe I'll do another one today. I've got a bunch of marking to do, which I can do at home.
Yep.
So I think I'm going to chill out at home today on Fridays are usually quite quiet days in the teaching world at university. Time to do marking.
Have you been on campus again recently? Like, have you been there recently? And what is the campus like? Is it still a bit of a ghost town, or are students flooding back in?
It is a lot busier than those first few weeks where I was really surprised by how quiet it was. So, yeah, a lot more people. I've been there once in the classroom over in the business school is the classroom we use, and that is full of people now.
Are they masked when they're in the lecture theatres and stuff? The students?
Yeah. So as I understand it, the advice that we're all given is that the students mask up and sit away from each other, and the lecturer masks up. But then when they're sort of at the very front of the class, they can take off their mask.
Man.
As far as I know, but I mean that really depends on the size of the place. And I've been trying to keep mine on as much as possible, though it's kind of hard when you're talking for 2 hours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here in Southern DHB, we're currently in the peak. So I think secondary school finishes in 2 or 3 weeks. So hopefully what I'm hoping is in term 2 secondary school time, which will be about the end of April, beginning of May. I think the 17th of April is Easter Sunday, which is the first weekend of the school holidays. That actually it's going to be behind us. That's fingers crossed for that. And the same for the university, I guess, and for everyone else in the country as well. Right. So today we are going to be chatting about a few things. Probably one of our big feature interviews. Well, it is because I've already done it, and it's a significant in length for an hour-long show. Is we are touching base again in the Ukraine with Tom Mutch, Kiwi journalist Tom Mutch, and Tom's leaving Ukraine. So we get all the information as to why he's leaving, where he's doing, what he's doing. We haven't talked to him this week, so it's a bit of an update as well. And we find out a little bit more about how good or bad the coffee is in Ukraine, because we asked the big questions here. Is the coffee any good? Because every time I go to him, he goes, hang on, just got to get my coffee. I'm like, maybe there's mind you, as a war correspondent, you imagine you're like this all the time anyway. So maybe it's an essential part of the war correspondent's kit is to have coffee. We're also going to be talking today a little bit about the conversation that happened earlier this week, which we haven't touched on. We just wanted to touch on it before the week was out, which were the comments around bottom feeding by Chris Luxon. Interesting article at werewolf.co.nz by Gordon Campbell. We'll have a look at that. We are also going to look at how we consume our media and what we're doing and what we're looking at. And we're going to start the show shortly from, there's a million universities, from Victoria University of Wellington, Dr. Marnie Law, who actually
Lloydd.
Lloydd, sorry. Oh, I said law because I was looking at the Faculty of Law, didn't I?
Yeah.
Dr. Marnie Lloydd, who's a lecturer at the Faculty of Law. She specializes in international law related to armed conflict. So she is an expert in finding out about international law around armed conflict, and she wrote a piece that was basically talking about, New Zealanders heading off to fight or to get to Ukraine. You might want to think about these things first. So we're going to get to that with Dr. Marnie Lloydd, hopefully within a couple of minutes or so. Anything else we need to know about today, George? Anything else going down?
No.
Well, we'll aim to get into that conversation with Tom Mutch around about past. And so between now and past, we'll be looking at and getting into the other things. Look, I'll tell you what, while we're waiting for Dr. Lloydd to come through, let's have a look at the first story, one of the stories we want to do, because we'll probably do this quite quickly because it's sort of a little bit of a review, really, on an article that Gordon Campbell did on Werewolf, because we heard about Christopher Luxon making his comments this week, about bottom feeding, and the piece that Gordon wrote was really interesting, and he basically referred bluntly to Christopher Luxon trashing the poor. This is a direct quote from the article. Luxon thinks the poor lack the ambition and positivity of their social and economic betters. Has Luxon ever actually met a poor person? If he had, he would know that the vast bulk of them do not lack ambition for themselves and their kids, nor are they lacking in the positivity and ingenuousness, I'll just say, that hundreds of thousands of them display every day as they make the best of it for themselves and their loved ones on a sliver of Luxon's income. Let's be clear. Just who is it that Luxon is writing off here? His bottom feeding category includes the people who stack the supermarket shelves and run the checkout tills, the nurses who care for the aged, the cleaners, the security guards, the people who drive ambulances, the baggage handlers, the teacher aides, the people who take out the rubbish, and the people who serve him his coffee. Plus every solo parent trying to raise a child on a benefit, everyone on a sickness benefit, and everyone suffering with mental health problems. So I think that's quite a interesting and damning, I would say, commentary on those comments. Now, of course, Christopher Luxon and National and his people have kind of respun it, talking about he wasn't talking about those people, but it's going to be interesting to watch the next 18 months. Obviously, the polls were good to Christopher Luxon and National last time around, but I will also remind everybody with Don Brash and his Ottawa speech, polls went through the roof. And then the following 12 to 18 months, I don't want to portray this as people saw the truth in them, but I'm saying that high didn't follow through for the rest of the lead up to the election. So it'll be interesting to see if these kinds of comments, and this comment in particular, will haunt Luxon over the forthcoming weeks and months, or whether they will still continue that stratospheric rise, which in most parts seems to be just a reaction to we want out of this current situation. But we'll continue to look at that as well. Yeah. Anything you want to add on there quickly, George, before we move on?
No, maybe we can touch base on it later.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Dr. Marnie Lloydd specializes in international law related to armed conflict and humanitarian law and policy. She's a lecturer at the Faculty of Law, Victoria University of Wellington. Dr. Marnie Lloydd joins us right now. Marnie, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
You'll have to forgive my little stumble there, but when I get something in my head, my dyslexia won't let go of it. And Marnie Lloydd, who is a lecturer in law, those words are being jumbled in my head a little bit, so I apologize in advance.
No problem at all.
And if I do it again, that's an apology in advance. Now let's bring up an article that was in the conversation because we really want to talk to it and about it. I'm trying to figure out how to do it. You wrote a piece for the conversation because it talks about academic rigor with journalistic flair. I'm a subscriber and I like the reads here. Your article is titled, "There is little to stop New Zealanders leaving to fight in Ukraine, but few legal protections if they do so." This week, we're attempting to, and we're going to maybe next week, speak to one of the Kiwis born in the Ukraine, who is going back to Ukraine. He left when he was 80, he's now 41. And so there are New Zealanders definitely going back, and we're interested as to what it all means, how it pans out, what it means legally, which is, I guess, what you've written about and what we've got you here talk about. So let's just start with the obvious question: is it legal or illegal for a Kiwi to fight in Ukraine right now?
Starting with the big hard question. Look,
Yeah,
I
man.
actually I did a whole PhD on this topic, so I've thought about it for years, and I still don't know if I have the full answer. Look, basically, so countries grapple with this, right? And different countries have different rules. Here in New Zealand, we've got laws that prohibit people being involved in mercenary activities. And then we've got laws, anti-terrorism laws, to prevent people being involved in terrorism. But we don't actually have an overarching law that prevents either foreign enlistment. So if someone wants to sign up and enlist in another country's military, or foreign fighting, which is usually a term, it's not a legal term, but it's used to describe people that might go and join a non-state armed group or some kind of militia group, or go and do something by themselves somehow. Some countries do have laws that are more robust. So Australia, for example, they've got a law that they call their foreign incursion law. So that would prevent people from travelling overseas in order to sort of take up arms against another state, so against another government. So their law is a bit more robust in that sense. But New Zealand doesn't have that. So all of that to say, I don't think that someone that went to fight in Ukraine would face prosecution on their return home, for example. But especially not if they're also a Ukrainian citizen. If they've got dual nationality, then that's sort of a different question. But I think what's really important to point out is that anyone fighting in Ukraine, whether they're part of the army, whether they're like a civilian volunteer that's participating, everybody needs to comply with the law of armed conflict. So that's the law that's set out in the Geneva Conventions and other bits and pieces of law. And if someone doesn't, if there's serious violations of that law, so that law is, don't target civilians, treat detainees humanely, that kind of thing, don't target hospitals. Serious violations of that law, they're war crimes. And so even if it's not unlawful under New Zealand domestic law for someone to go, if there's evidence that they've done something wrong while they're fighting, then they could for sure be prosecuted for war crimes under New Zealand law.
I want a question on that. I've got a couple of questions straight away. I'll jot down mercenary to come back to it. The Geneva Convention is fascinating because it seems that there is no such thing as a war that abides by the Geneva Convention. Because I understand that as soon as a civilian dies, you've broken the Geneva Convention, and there isn't a war anywhere ever at any stage where civilians don't perish. Maybe you could say at the moment, maybe Ukrainians aren't killing Russian civilians, but I'm interested as to how that actually gets used, because I don't know enough about it. You're the expert, but it appears to me that there's no such thing as a war following Geneva Conventions because civilians always seem to die. Is that accurate, or am I missing something? Well, I'm missing a lot, but am I missing something in particular?
I think what you're saying is accurate, and you're also missing something, if I can be so bold as to say that.
Sure.
So yeah, fully agree. I mean, it's clear that war is bad and people die and civilians bear the brunt of it. Let's face it. I mean, soldiers are also directly in the firing line. Lots of soldiers are going to die, have long-term injuries, have long-term trauma, but civilians really bear the brunt, and that's all over the world and all different kinds of conflict. The thing with this law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law is another name for it, law of war, Geneva Conventions law, and actually it's a little bit of a controversial part of it, is that it does not, its purpose is to try to restrain violence in war, to try to reduce harm, to protect civilians and civilian houses and hospitals and that kind of thing. But it also allows it. So not every civilian death is a war crime.
Right.
Some kind of incidental harm, you will have heard this term collateral damage.
Sure.
So there can be lawful collateral damage as well as unlawful collateral damage. And Yeah, so an enemy, if you're in a war, an enemy under these Geneva Conventions is allowed to kill the enemy. They're not allowed to directly target a civilian, but they are allowed to target and kill their enemy, and that's not a war crime, obviously.
But as soon as they target a civilian location, you couldn't really call that collateral damage, could you? And I guess what I'm saying is, I can't think of a war at any stage ever that hasn't at some stage sent a missile, dropped a bomb or something in a civilian area. So it's like, is the Geneva Convention something to aim towards? But realistically, it's never really happened in a war. Like, has there ever been a war where the Geneva Convention was adhered to?
So there's actually lots of examples where so I agree with you, that's probably never, ever, ever been adhered to fully, right?
Yeah.
But there are lots of examples where those rules have worked, have been respected, and people have been protected, where aid workers have been, kept safe, where families have been reunited, where POWs have been looked after properly. So there are good examples, and of course we focus on the bad stuff, and fair enough, because it's just atrocious what we see. We see what's going on, and it's horrible. So huge problem in the respect for this law, but there are examples where it has helped.
But you're saying that there's moments within the good examples within conflict where it's adhered to, as opposed to saying it's adhered to for the whole conflict. I also wanted to ask you about the mercenary side of things. You said it's illegal to be or to act as a mercenary in New Zealand. We're reading articles about former New Zealand Defence Force veterans, or Defence Force veterans, quote unquote, escorting people to Ukraine. Now, I guess I don't mean to kind of nut down too much into that word, but to escort someone there seems like it's more than just altruistic. It seems like it's potentially, I don't know, but I mean, when we get to talk to our guy, we'll ask him this, but a financial incentive or reward or something in there. And if that is the case, if these former defense forces then end up taking up arms in Ukraine, are they technically mercenaries when they're on the ground in New Zealand, i.e., I'm at the airport escorting, my purpose for leaving is to escort this person, or do they become mercenaries when they pick up a gun in that land?
That's a really good. Are you sure you're not a lawyer deep down? That's a real lawyer's question. So listen, the definition of them. So the term mercenary kind of gets bandied around a lot, and fair enough, because we use it in day-to-day speech. Legally speaking, there's quite a long definition, and you have to meet these kind of cumulative criteria. And one of the criteria is, so one is that you're foreign, one is that you've been recruited especially to go and fight in that overseas war, one is that you're not enlisted in the armed forces. So, so for example, people that do choose to go to Ukraine and are accepted into this foreign legion that Ukraine has set up, that foreign legion is officially part of the Ukrainian armed forces. So they'd fall out. So all of these criteria, as long as you can easily fall out from it. It's quite hard to fit into it. The key thing with the mercenary is the financial. It's someone who's motivated for financial reasons to go. And under the New Zealand law, if I'm not mistaken, it says that the person has to be paid substantially more than what a local soldier would be paid.
Okay.
Which I don't think is the case with this foreign legion. Now, if someone's going sort of independently and escorting someone, it sounds to me more like a kind of private security detail. The risk there is that one of the criteria of being a mercenary is that you actually have to fight. You have to directly participate in the hostilities. So people that are doing training or acting as a medic or something like that wouldn't fall into that necessarily. The trouble is, once you're over there and you need to defend yourself, it's likely, or it could happen, that someone then, even if they weren't intending to fight, they're going to protect themselves and they might end up fighting. And that might bring them closer, and they'll lose their protection. If they would be a civilian, and then if the civilian starts directly participating in the hostilities, the enemy is allowed to attack them, then they're not protected anymore by this Geneva Convention's law. However weak that might have been anyway in the first place to protect them, right? But legally speaking, they would start participating, and they would be able to be targeted.
I'm reminded of Syria, Marnie, and some British nationals that would come back home from Syria fighting alongside the Kurds and suddenly be charged under the Terrorism Act. I remember the same thing happening in America. So I guess what you're saying is, as long as a Kiwi would fight with the Foreign Legion that the Ukrainian government has set up, and not end up fighting for, maybe if the Azov battalion was branded a terrorism organization by the New Zealand government, as long as they're not fighting for these non-state actors, they have a legal sort of right to be there.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a sort of much less concern, I would say, someone that's signing up for a foreign military. The Kurdish example is really super interesting because technically it's a non-state group. It was the Syrian Kurdish forces that were fighting at one stage against the Islamic State group, and then subsequently, there's been things with Turkey as well. And yeah, indeed, so Great Britain, the UK tried to prosecute a few people. New Zealand had a couple of people that went and fought with those forces as well. So the UK tried to prosecute them, and none of those prosecutions went very well. People were saying it doesn't make sense because these people were fighting on the side that the UK government was actually supporting. So how can you then prosecute someone? And especially if you're trying to prosecute them with anti-terrorism legislation, it was even sort of another complication. And there's really practical issues of how to get evidence, up to a criminal standard of what was happening. Countries normally rely on these sort of mutual criminal assistance things to get evidence from overseas, but when the country's, in the middle of a war, that's not really going to be possible. So, yeah, a lot of those prosecutions fell flat, and it's really something that countries grapple with. And I think it's obvious, right? We can feel it. We see any kind of Facebook post or whatever, Twitter, whatever, people saying, oh, I'm going to go. And you'll see the mixture of comments. So some people are saying, oh, thank you, and you're so brave, and God bless you, good on you, and, and other people are like, dude, what, how arrogant, how are you, why, it's not your decision to go and take up arms. So it's obviously highly political. And the trouble for countries trying to make law about it is, it would be quite nice. It would be nice to have one law that's a clear law and it applies to everyone. And but then in reality, when you look at a local context, you kind of want that flexibility. You don't want to go here, but we don't mind so much if you go here. And so that's the problem: is how do you have a clear law, one rule, and then but you've got these exceptions because politically there's
Yeah, because that flexibility often coincides with where the home country is politically, right? They were fighting alongside the Kurds against ISIS, for example.
Yeah, so what if they fight for Russia? That's one of the other questions. What happens if they go? If New Zealanders go and fight for Russia? I mean, is what Russia's doing? Are they committing war atrocities? Are they committing war crimes? If a Kiwi goes to fight for Russia, then what?
Yeah, so that's a really good example of how these complications come up. You think, oh, it'd be good, let's just have one rule and it applies to everyone. But then actually, we might feel okay about someone joining the Ukrainian military, but not the Russian military right now. Or, it can be hard for dual citizens. Some dual citizens have got, some countries still have conscription, so they've got to do a military service. And then what happens if their other nationality is a country that New Zealand politically is not on that side of in a particular thing? So, yeah, they're really complex issues. The law is complex because there's laws on the international level, and then each country will have their own domestic law that is supposed to reflect international law. But there's enough ambiguity there that different countries have ended up with different rules. And so you'll see about foreign fighting pieces that are sort of saying, oh, US former soldiers can go, British might be able to go, New Zealanders can go, Australians can't go, or another country. Some countries are more strict on it than and others are more permissive.
I've got it might be another lawyer question. I didn't mean it to be, but it might be another lawyer question for you, Dr. Lloyd. In most countries, most of the time, it's illegal to shoot and kill someone. What does the law say, or like, where is the line about a foreign national coming into a country, shooting and killing people in the name of war? And even in the region, I was kind of talking to George before the show, and I said, if I walked into Poland right now, right next door to Ukraine, and shot and killed people, I'd be arrested and tried and convicted of whatever. But then if I go 50 kilometers across a border and do it probably as long as they're Russian, I'm seen as a freedom fighter and a hero. How do we figure out that line in these kinds of situations? And I guess an addendum to that is, do we need to be careful, and is anything legally about why someone's going there? If you had a mass murderer who just wanted to kill people and then they use this experience to go there and shoot and kill people, is that something that needs to be worried about as well?
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with the second one.
Sure.
So we know from Ukraine, I mean, there's been people volunteering on both sides of the Ukraine conflict from 2014. And there have been concerns that some of those people demonstrate support for right-wing extremist views, for white supremacist views. So, I mean, there's always that risk, either that someone sort of gets more exposure or more connections to those sorts of networks. But even without that, just having been in a war scenario, it's my background before I started working at Victoria University was with the International Red Cross. I've worked in lots of war zones. I've worked in Afghanistan. I've worked in Sri Lanka. I've worked in the Somali part of Ethiopia. I've worked in Yemen. I've worked in Gaza, all over the place. I mean, they're traumatic situations, especially for the local people. Obviously, I'm not trying to compare my experiences with people from the countries suffering armed conflict, but even for aid workers, it can be traumatic, and then for soldiers even more. And then, so I think that is a concern of, it might only end up being a few New Zealanders, but those New Zealanders might need certain support when they come back, or there might be certain risks just from the violence that they've been exposed to. So that is definitely something that is talked about and connected to these issues. And then the other question about, we couldn't just pick up weapons here and start shooting at people. So how come when we cross the border, then suddenly it seems like we could do it? And there's a couple of things there. So one is, it's this idea during war that certain people have what's known as a combatant's privilege. So it means that if, say, imagine you're a soldier, an army, you can shoot at your enemy. You're not going to be prosecuted for murder after that. And we can understand that. So it's called a sort of privilege. And yeah, that's a bit the problem, that if people are fighting in an armed group or as a sort of civilian who's picked up arms, and then they don't have that privilege. And that's where you hear that language about sort of unprivileged combatants.
Right.
And the problem with that is that, so under the Geneva, on the international level, under the Geneva Conventions law, that's not really a problem, but it can be a problem under domestic law. And so, yes, someone could be prosecuted. I mean, Ukraine has been calling on its population to join these volunteer brigades and to help out. So I don't think Ukraine is going to be prosecuting. But the risk is if you fell into the hands of the enemy, if you were captured, and potentially some countries, once people go home. So if they were, say, in an armed group somewhere, wherever in the world, and then came back to New Zealand, I actually don't know in New Zealand whether our Crimes Act, whether all those provisions can be applied for extraterritorial action or only for action like a murder charge, for example. I admit I don't know. I'm not a domestic criminal lawyer, but that's something obviously I need to look into. But yeah, so how come you can go and do that over there, something that you can't do here? It's also a reason some people say, look, if you really want to fight, then join the armed forces and do it through the proper channels somehow. And other people say governments are the ones that often cause problems, right? So there's also this thing about rebellion and supporting insurgency, that sometimes it can be for good reasons. That's why it's so interesting, all these tensions. Yeah.
Also, you think about individual groups could have their justifications for why, for example, violence or armed conflict might be true. I think too, even America right now, that seems to be breaking in three pieces because of what some people think, that civil war is on the way. Or I think to things like the Urewera raids, that sort of thing. There's sometimes there is groups or individuals that think it's highly probable, right, correct to take up arms, but they might be wrong. so I guess that becomes even more problematic. Dr. Lloyd, we want to talk to you more, but it's kind of time for us to move on. And me and George were just messaging away before as we're wrapping up. Can we grab you back at some stage next week? And because I know George in particular has got a shitload more questions to kind of bounce around and bounce off you, sort of thing.
Yeah.
If we can
with pleasure, absolutely. No, with pleasure. I could talk about this for hours. As I said, I've been thinking about it for years and years. I still don't have all the answers, but very happy to talk about everything.
Well, the other thing is we're just about to go to Ukraine and talk to Tom Mutch.
I want to hear that as well. So
yeah, I've actually already done that conversation. So not spoilers, but he also brought up the point, and I don't think we've talked about it here yet, is that if you are a Ukrainian citizen and you go inside the borders of Ukraine right now and you're of fighting age and you're male, you can't leave, which is another interesting aspect of this whole conversation as well. So I'm not sure if that was in your article, and I'm sure it probably was. I didn't have a good read, but sometimes my dyslexia slides things sideways.
It's not, but there is, I don't know if it's in the conversation or somewhere else. I can forward it to you. Someone has written a short piece on that and talking about human rights issues, because normally we have a human right that we're allowed to leave any country, including our own country. So there is a piece about that. I can find it for you, and happy to talk about that at another time.
So we will be in touch, and maybe we'll grab you again next week and talk some more about this, because much of the things we like to do here in a more conversational look at the news, we could keep going as well. And I think we do want to keep going. We'll just do it on another day if that's all good with you.
That is all good. Thanks so much. Right. It's been a pleasure chatting.
Oh, look, it's been an absolute blast. We are glad to have connected with you. Just trying to bring up my document here, because the other thing I get wrong all the time, Dr. Lloyd, is names of universities. George will tell you that. From Victoria University of Wellington, why they changed the name to that, I don't know, but that's just my opinion. Lecturer in the Faculty of Law, Dr. Marnie Lloyd. Marnie, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Take good care.
All right, cheers.
Yeah.
Whew. Wow, lots going on there, George. That was really interesting. Yeah, and look, I do hour and a half podcasts, and I think I could have Marnie on to do a whole podcast about this kind of stuff. In fact, maybe I'll even approach you to do one of those in the not too distant future. Anything you want to? And I know, George, you had more questions, and I'm sorry that we kind of had to wrap that up, but we do have another interview coming up that we want to get to, etc. as well. But anything you want to mention now, seeing we're just coming at the back of that?
I don't want to really get into it, but when we have Marnie on again, we can talk about this, because I think there is a connection to what we were talking about with Dr. Olivier Dutel and sort of this word of blowback, right? And the sort of connection between the Christchurch mosque shooting in Ukraine and the prospect of Australasian right-wingers going to Ukraine, getting battle experience, getting hardened ideologically, and then coming back home, right? The old problem that we had with fighters going to Syria. So, but yeah, lots of time to talk about that.
I'd like to have a quick chat with you, George. And actually, people who are watching right now, mention in the comments what subscriptions you have to watch media outlets. Who has Netflix? Who has Discovery? Who has Spotify? Add it up. We did this yesterday, and I think I got to, 8 paid subscriptions that I belong to just for content alone. So if you're watching right now and you can mention in the comments, we'd like to know what kind of subscription models you guys have and what you guys follow. Earlier in the week, we had news coming out, and it's maybe not necessarily big news in and of itself, but that Sky Sport was going up by $3 a month, which may not seem like a particularly big story in and of itself, but it did cause us to kind of go, yeah, how are we consuming our content at the moment? What are we consuming, and what are we prepared to do? This feels like it will be another one of these conversations which will go on in the future. I've just had a conversation on my email and text with a few people who are involved in providing content. I won't say who it is in case they don't end up coming on, but of some pretty big mainstream media outlets in New Zealand about what they do and how they do it. I'd like to know from them how a provider, what they do to provide content. And from our side of things, George, we're consumers. What do we do what are we prepared to pay or put up with to take? Oh, God, someone's just mentioned Audible. Kim's just mentioned Audible. That's another one I have to add to my list. So I don't even know what I've got sometimes. I've got Audible as well. And actually, I do pay for a subscription to YouTube as well, so I don't get adverts. So that's actually two more that I've just added in there. Thanks for making my life more depressing there, Kim. But from our side of things, we're consumers, and what we're prepared to pay or put up with to receive our content. And I'll give you an example. This is actually a Facebook post, which no one can see because it's so small, from 2016 that I put up on my page. And it says this: quick hint, TVNZ On Demand, if you play more ad breaks than are on the actual broadcast, you'll lose viewers like me. Hashtag back to the internet. So at one point, I wasn't prepared to pay 4 or 5 minutes of my time to watch stuff on TVNZ On Demand. So I'm talking about paying with my time, and I wasn't prepared to do it. So I went back to the internet and I continue to consume my content from there. However, now TVNZ On Demand, I think, have hit the sweet spot perfectly. When they play an ad break, it might be 30 seconds, it might be 45 seconds, it might be 60 seconds. And to be honest with you, I'm prepared to pay that. I'm prepared to wait 30 or 60 seconds to be able to use the platform they've got to, you know, how when you're watching online, George, you don't often get to, if you stop halfway through, you can't kind of measure where you're at and you've got to come back and scroll back to it. Whereas using the platforms, TVNZ On Demand, Netflix, Disney, etc., when you get out of it, you come back to exactly the same spot. So for that convenience, I am prepared to pay TVNZ On Demand maybe 30 seconds worth of adverts. So I think in the past 6 years, they've figured that out and they've hit the right mark at the moment. So I am prepared to pay that. The Herald came out, and you'll laugh at this, George, because I said I was going to get a subscription. The Herald were the first kind of big place to go out and put a paywall up, and they're pretty happy with what they got. I thought it was too expensive to start off with, so I didn't want to be involved with it. But in saying that, they had a special on last week, which you'll now see, George, has finished, where you could have got a digital annual deal for just $99. Now, I was going to buy that. I hadn't got around to it, and I've missed it. So guess what? I'm not going to buy it yet because I'm not prepared to pay $149 for their digital deal. I was prepared to pay $99 to get access to their digital deal. So there's some financial lines in the sand we draw, and other, like our time, lines we're prepared to draw to consume content. Andrew says YouTube Premium. Yep, that's the one of the ones that I've got as well. And Disney Plus. I think, Andrew, if you look at it, you might have more. You on Spotify? Come on, think about it. Vale says Netflix, Disney Plus, F1 TV, Sky TV with HBO, Curiosity Stream. Curiosity Stream's only like $12 a year, I think, and that's a really good stream. I haven't invested in that yet, but I probably will. And Blast Beat says only Patreon about. I'm not sure what that means, but there you go, only Patreon about. There's other things, and I wanted to highlight this one. One of the reasons I wanted to highlight this one is I'm involved with these guys at the moment, actually. Stuff Circuit is a really interesting group of investigative journalists and documentary makers. I was lucky enough to talk to Paula Penfold, who's kind of their main investigative journalist, in a podcast that's uploaded today, actually, on our channel or others. And they've just done one on fetal alcohol syndrome. It's not called that anymore. It's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it's unbelievably good content. And that doesn't cost a cent other than, I think at the start of that documentary, there was about 3 minutes of ads. But I think for 3 minutes of ad followed by 60 minutes of content, I'm actually okay with that as well. I'm prepared to pay that and then watch a very, very good documentary. So anyway, George, how do you consume content? What do you see in this whole situation between what you're prepared to pay?
It's an interesting point, right? Thinking of paying as more than just the subscription or dollar amount that we're paying, right? We pay our time to watch ads, and much more, increasingly so in the age of social media or YouTube, we're paying in terms of the platforms recording our activity, right? The way we consume becomes monetized itself, which then is, a form of payment that we're giving as well. So our very consumption becomes monetized as well. So we pay for the consuming through our consumption of the content. Right?
But that's the traditional model. Television stations got ads, radio stations got ads. You get any of those local free papers, they're full of ads. We're paying with our time. We're basically saying to them, you can throw ads at me and I'll have your content for free. That model's falling over the world over, and we're going to things like paywalls, subscription models, Patreons, that sort of thing. And we're in a bit of a flux at the moment, and I think it's interesting to find out how and why people are consuming the media they're consuming.
What I'm saying is it goes deeper than that, right? It's our habits, it's our digital data self, as academics would call it, that is monetized. It's more than just the ads we watch. But yeah, me myself, I mean, I'm a proponent of pirating. I think that's totally ethically okay for the most part. If it's big studio films and that sort of thing. And really try and keep the monthly subscriptions to a minimum. I don't use ad blocker on YouTube or online because I'm a media studies scholar, so right. I want to see what sort of ads are going. I want to see the ads. But yeah, and if there's something very particular, for a little bit, I'd subscribe to the WRC, the rally, specialty sort of thing, like Emperor's mentioned, the F1 TV. But for everything else, pirating is definitely still, I think, the model to follow.
And some people would say that there's a price to that as well. It might be a moral price for some. Yeah. Obviously, you're saying it's fine for you, but someone once pointed out to me when I was talking about, I do have a Sky Sports subscription through my Vodafone TV, so it's much more expensive than actually being a Sky customer. I'm a Vodafone customer, and that comes sort of with the package. Is that I was doing something similar to you and saying something similar to you, and then the person pointed out, obviously, someone's got to pay for it. Someone, the reason that, for example, we have some of the best rugby coverage in the world because we're best skilled at, because it's cost tens of hundreds of millions of dollars over the last, X amount of years, training up the systems, paying for the graphics, doing all of that. So someone's got to pay for it. So whilst I'm not being a little angel here and say, I watch stuff on the internet as well. For me, there's a bit of a moral cost to that, because I know someone's paying for it somewhere, and it's not me. I do watch a lot on the internet as well. So I think for a lot of people, that's still something to talk about when it comes to what does this cost you. In theory as well, there was, trying to think who it was. There was a bit of an upstand ISP that put in a geo blocker on their ISP, so no one could see where they were. They had to take it off because that straight away meant that all of their customers could get access to all of the Netflix and all of the Hulus and all of the HBOs all over the world, which was a problem. But it was hiding people's places, hiding people's ISPs. What I was trying to get to, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second, was there could also be a punitive damage for pirating once things happen, and once ISPs start to get tracked a bit more, and once ISPs get responsible for what goes across their systems as opposed to just being the supplier of systems. Netflix has announced they're going to stop account sharing. I don't know how they do that, maybe through ISP tracking, I don't know. But anyway, it's just a conversation which I think is interesting as to what we actually consume and how we consume it. Emperor says, I love TVs on demand. They have quite a few programs that I've enjoyed, and their sci-fi channel is pretty good. More than happy to pay via watching ads and data pulled through those evil cookies. Yeah, that's another point, paying with your data as well. Yeah. But if it was Emperor like it was at the start, which honestly TVNZ would play, it plays about 3.5 minutes of adverts, and there was times on demand where there was 5 minutes of adverts. And I was like, come on guys, you're not going to get me to watch you if you're going to. The reason I want to use the internet is for less interaction with ads. If you're giving me more interaction, I'm not going to stay and watch that. So yeah, anywho, interesting. Anything else on that one, George?
No, otherwise we'll never get to Tom.
Yeah. Okay. Now listen, this is a conversation I had with Tom in the last 12 hours. Tom is leaving Ukraine, so I'm going to play this conversation back. It means, George, if you want to head off now, we can say see you later, because this is kind of 25 minutes or so, and then I can just wrap up the end. If you want to stay and watch it and talk to me at the end, that's fine as well. So here is so what are you going to do, George? You're going to hang around? You're going to take off?
I'm off. See you,
All right.
folks.
All right.
Thanks,
George.
everyone, tuning in. I'll see you on Monday.
Talk to you over the weekend. And so this is me catching up with Kiwi journalist Tom Mutch, who is in Ukraine, who we have talked to several times from Ukraine, getting an update as to what's going on, what he's at, what he's seen, and as a journalist, what's happening in Ukraine. Kiwi journalist Tom Mutch in Ukraine. Tom, gosh, I was going to say good evening. It's good evening for one of us and good morning for the other. I'll just say hi. Hi, how you doing, man?
Hi, how you doing? I'm all right. I'm all right, thanks.
You safe?
Yeah. Well safe here.
Yeah, things going well for you. Where are you at the moment?
I'm currently in Lviv, so I'm about to leave Ukraine just for a short break. I kind of needed up in here since the start, so
that's the plan. You're heading out of country for a while because you just need a break, need some space.
I need a bar, yeah, just for a week, maybe two, but then I'll back to it.
What does a war correspondent do when they're taking a week off?
I mean, some people, it depends. Some of us do completely normal things. One girl said she wanted to spend her vacation in Saudi Arabia, and I was like, okay, you enjoy that. Not quite for me. I'm just gonna go chill out. I'm gonna go to Paris. It's one of my best friend's birthdays there, so I'll go there. Honestly, have a few beers because booze has been banned in Ukraine for the last month. So nothing too intense.
I would have thought primarily because of the location and the akinness in the past to the Russian people, vodka would have been pretty big in Ukraine. Is that a drink of choice normally?
It is a drink of choice normally, but it's been banned. And I actually, as I found out, it's been banned for very, very good reason. I've got a little anecdote I can tell you about if you like. So basically, they temporarily re-allowed the sale of booze about 3 or 4 days ago now. And I was in Kharkiv on Saturday or Sunday. And I remember that, I turn up to the supermarket about 10 a.m. There's some guy, people are buying alcohol. It's the first time I've seen it. And there's this one guy, he's just a bit out of it. He's like just chatting to me in Russian, which I barely understand.
Yeah. And
he's buying booze like 10 a.m. He's already plastered. And in a way, I felt, okay, this is almost like feeling like life's getting back to normal again. But then gets a bit scarier later. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm just walking along with like the Ukrainians who I'm working with and another one of my journalist friends, and all of a sudden someone starts screaming at me, stop in Russian. And I turn towards it, and there's this police guy who's just running towards me. He's got his gun like pointed literally right at my head. Oh. And he's like, what are you doing? I'm like, whoa. Like, and he comes up to me, I can smell his breath is stinking of booze. He like grabs my camera, rips it off me. He starts like yelling at us. Meanwhile, the whole time he's got his gun like kind of going between my chest and my head. I'm like, whoa, Jesus. And thankfully he's with colleagues who are like calming him down, but he keeps on like yelling, like, who are you? Why do you want to talk to people here? Why do you want to take photos? And I'm like, well, we're journalists. He's like, yeah, but why do journalists interview people? Why do they take photos? Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, that was pretty scary. Drunk people with guns at your head, it's never fun.
I think we've kind of talked about this before. We've talked about, have you been in any hairy situations and scary situations? Like, not to just focus on Ukraine, but what you've just told us, is that like one of the times you've been kind of most worried about your own personal safety? Does anything else jump to mind, especially of the current conflict?
So weirdly enough, it's different people. This is one thing I noticed: different people get in war zones get scared by very different things. When I hear shooting, small arms fire, I get a bit spooked. When I hear artillery, for whatever reason, artillery or explosions, it just kind of doesn't bother me because I'm like, So it seems so sort of like up in the sky and kind of an act of God, but I almost feel like I can't really do much about it. I've been in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We had a Turkish drone flying after our car, taking shots at us. That was pretty scary.
Yeah.
Ukraine so far, like I was in the outskirts of Kiev, and there was a gun battle broke out probably about a kilometer or two away from where I was, but it never got to our positions, so we didn't have like shots going over our heads or anything else. I mean, after a while, it just kind of becomes part of the job. You just get used to it in a weird sort of way.
It's madness, isn't it? And then in the same instance, you put a message on your Facebook page or a picture on your Facebook page of Lviv, where you are, and it looks like any European city just kind of hanging out doing their thing.
Completely. Like that could so easily be Poland or Prague or Budapest or whatever, couldn't it?
Or Paris, where you're about to go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so the west of Ukraine still hasn't really been hit. Now there have been a few. There was a missile strike on a base near Lviv, but in terms of life in the city, it's pretty much gone back to normal. And not only that, it used to be kind of very, very chaotic and crowded because it was full of refugees trying to get out. By now, most people who wanted to leave Ukraine have left Ukraine. Probably I'd say it's in the millions now. It keeps on rising and rising. I think it's up to about 4 million or so. But most people who want to leave have left by now. So it's kind of calmed itself down. And even in like war times, people find like a rhythm of life. Even if it's a new rhythm of life, they still find a rhythm that they get back into.
There must be that constant anxiety though, that like you get into the rhythm, but that tomorrow morning the tanks could be there or whatever date things could be happening. But I'm interested in how life can go back to normal even in war zones. And it's a bit of a flippant or silly example, but I remember watching an episode of Top Gear where they did the Middle East run and they landed in Iraq and then they went up through and down. But 500 meters to the right, there might be kids playing in the playground, or life can continue on some level of normality for people living in war zones, which sounds bizarre to say that out loud, but I mean, you've just shown it. And I guess it's something we need to remember as well, that there are people there just living lives in a war zone.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, and obviously I don't say this as like to say, oh, the media's lying to you, or it's all like, exaggerating stuff, but like what gets shown on the news is the worst parts, right?
Yeah,
like the stuff you see it's all very true and very, very important to show, but it is the most extreme aspects of what is going on, which is why sometimes I like to post videos like that just to show a little bit of the other side. Like, okay, it's not all like this, like all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, that you see the worst 5%, but the rest of it is just people trying to live their normal lives. Now, a lot of their normal lives has completely changed. Most people's jobs have stopped being their ordinary jobs, and they're in some way supporting the military effort. So, most people I know who are like, lawyers or consultants, they all like work in volunteer shelters. They try and coordinate logistics for the armed forces and everything like that. But even in Kharkiv, for instance, which I was at, which is like one of the worst bombed places, I was actually surprised. It was very interesting to see in Kharkiv, which has just been bombed, really. What I was surprised to see was how people there were actually a bit calmer and a bit more relaxed than people further west, where the war hadn't really started yet, where people were a lot more tense.
Almost like the ones further west, almost like the fear of the unknown, because it's not here yet. We're more freaked out than the people who are in it are like, this is terrible, but we can manage.
Exactly. Yeah. Because in Kharkiv, they've been through 3-4 weeks of extraordinarily intense bombardment, but they're like, okay, we know how to deal with this now. Our lives, our sort of mental states and our emotional states and our physical conditions have adjusted to being able to accept this. So now, and it's like, well, we've seen the worst of it, and we've survived the worst of it, so we know we can handle it. Whereas people in the West are still a little bit more like, oh my God, what's going to happen? I'm not saying it's not terrible, but it's how people sort of adjust.
You're talking about people's jobs have kind of evolved into supporting the war efforts. We were going to talk to someone yesterday. We are going to talk to them before they leave, but there's people coming from all over the world to Ukraine to fight. So we've got an interview set up with a guy who's 41. He was born in Ukraine. He moved to New Zealand when he was 8. He is coming back to Ukraine to fight. How do the Ukrainians on the ground there today feel about? I mean, he's not a foreign national. He's a Ukrainian who has moved away. I'll just put you in full screen while I fix my camera. Who has moved away and come back. But how do the Ukrainians feel about foreign nationals and I guess their former citizens coming back for the purpose of fighting?
So important to differentiate between the two. I think a lot of Ukrainians feel quite that Ukrainians who live overseas, most Ukrainians I think feel that these people should be coming back, or at least the men of fighting age should be coming back and should be supporting the war effort. And I think the numbers, quite high numbers, we're talking like 400, 500,000 like men of fighting age have returned to Ukraine to fight, knowing, by the way, that as soon as they step foot across the Ukrainian border, they will not be allowed to leave until the war ends.
Wow.
So the very, very brave sacrifice that they're making. In terms of the actual other soldiers, so it's interesting, is that I think the Ukrainians know that in terms of like, they're not going to get like the amount of international volunteers that would actually change the war effort, but they're going to get two things out of it. One, it shows the international community's solidarity and makes the international community putting more skin in the game, means they're going to get more media attention because, a Ukrainian soldier is not going to make the news in New Zealand like a New Zealand volunteer is going to make the news in New Zealand, and the same for Australia, UK, whatever. Also, I know a couple of people out here, and I can't give too many details, but they include Kiwis who are former military who are out here, and as soon as they cross the border, they've been like, okay, you guys are going to train all of the volunteers we need to train up, right? So they've got a very important role there in training, because the Ukrainians are not really conscripted because so many people haven't needed to, so many people have volunteered, but a lot of those people are now being trained by sort of ex-British or New Zealand or Australian military or what have you.
Actually, I've got a question really about the conscription. Because, and I know that I asked you about COVID, and you basically were like, "Oh fuck, we're not more worried about war than COVID over here at the moment." And maybe this is a bit of a similar question because it's about Fox News, but there's some criticism of Ukraine on Fox News by some of its commentators, and one of the criticisms was, gosh, what kind of country would have to conscript its people? Of course, ignoring their 100 years of history, going right up into the Vietnam War where they were conscripting their own people. But it was sort of one of the criticisms. And then also, and I'm sure you've heard of this, there was a leaked memo from the Kremlin telling Russian media to play as much Tucker Carlson as possible. This is what the memo said. It's essential to use as much fragments of broadcasts of the popular Fox News host Tucker Carlson, who sharply criticizes the actions of the United States and NATO, their negative role in unleashing the conflict in Ukraine, and the defiantly provocative behavior from the leadership of the Western countries and NATO towards the Russian Federation and towards President Putin personally. Does that kind of news get through to you guys in Ukraine? Are Ukrainians hearing about this American network who has this appearance that they're kind of supporting Putin over Zelensky, as crazy as that sounds? And is there any reaction to it?
Okay, so I'll go through I'll deal with the conscription one first. So this conscription one is interesting in the sense that, look, so, I mean, yes, technically conscription exists, but no one is getting press ganged into military service here. I mean, I've heard this from a lot of people. It's a joke, but it's a joke that's based on reality, is that they have so many people who've signed up to fight, they don't even have enough weapons to give them at the moment, Ukraine used to have compulsory military service, as a lot of countries do, right? South Korea, Singapore, even some of the Scandinavian countries would have, like Israel, the most obvious example, would have like a few years of compulsory military service. I think in Ukraine they had one for men. And they said, look, people used to bribe their way out of military service. Now the queues are so long, people are bribing their way into military service, right?
I have to say that was one of the responses by some American commentators with the criticism of the conscription model that is being said also on American television, that there's too many people volunteering at the moment to even worry about conscription. So that's actually been getting out there to the critics of Fox News. What about what Fox News is actually saying? What do the people in Ukraine think about that? Is that making any noise in Ukraine?
Yeah. Okay, so also I do want to say here, and I don't mean to be like, I don't mean to sound like I'm supporting Fox News here, but you can't say that Fox News is just Tucker Carlson, right?
Of course, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah, he is one of their very popular hosts. But look, Fox News have actually, and this is the very strange thing, is that Fox News have actually done good reporting out in Ukraine. There was the Fox News crew that was killed in one of the most dangerous parts of Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. So I don't want to sort of say, everything Fox has done here has been bad. But yes, it has.
Let me just say before we go on, completely fair. I kind of used the phrase Fox News when we were talking specifically about Tucker Carlson. So yeah, let's just keep it to Tucker Carlson. I accept that. You're correct. So let's not muddy the waters and just talk about the Tucker Carlson support of Russia and Putin.
Well, I mean, Ukrainians have seen it. Also, most Ukrainians, don't necessarily. But I'm talking about the younger, the more educated ones. I had lunch with a young woman yesterday who used to live in Louisiana who spent a year at high school in Louisiana, and she said, "Yes, I'm familiar with all these people. Yes," and she's like, they're one of the biggest thorns in our side because we worry that while support is overwhelming for Ukraine now, that like down the road, gas prices start to hike in America, or there's some knock-on effects of this war in the rest of the world, that these people like Tucker Carlson or whoever they might find a more sympathetic audience once the war starts to hit the pockets of like ordinary Americans, if that makes sense. So that's one thing that they are really quite concerned about.
There's some reports, and I think you might have either reported this or passed on the report as well, that for a while there was some sympathy towards Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine. The reports are now any sympathy or any kind of care for Russians in that part of Ukraine is now gone. It's been abandoned. Is that accurate? Is that happening? Can you expand on that at all?
Absolutely. So I literally, as I said, I was in Kharkiv, but for those who don't know, Kharkiv is the second biggest city in Ukraine. It's right on the border with Russia. It's got about 1.5 million people, I think, maybe a little bit more. And it is completely Russian, like the Russian speaking is like 98% of the population or whatever. And it's a city that used to be part of the Russian Empire. All the architecture is sort of very grand imperial Russian architecture. And it's also, as I said earlier, I think one of the most heavily bombed places in the country. And you go there, and I just wrote like a long. Anyone who wants to read this in more detail, I just wrote a long feature article about this from a US magazine. Is basically that what has happened is they are even more angry and there's even more hatred for Russia in these previous parts than there was beforehand, because they say, these are in some cases literally our brothers, our cousins. Like this one woman I did an interview with, she was literally pulling her belongings from the rubble of her house, and she's like, "It's the Russian terrorists who did this, and my father is Russian." Right? Wow. She gave another example where one of the other people who lived in her apartment, he was FaceTiming. He was in hospital. He was FaceTiming with his sister who lives in Moscow. And his sister's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It's so horrible that the Nazis did that to you." And he's like, "No, this isn't the Nazis." Wow. She's like, "Yes, it was. It was other Ukrainians. Russia doesn't do this. We know this from our news. This was the Nazi Ukrainians who did this to you." Like even when her own brother is in a hospital bed, like that. And so all of those like long-standing linguistic, cultural, familial ties between Eastern Ukraine and Russia are just being absolutely destroyed. And I don't think that will take generations, maybe hundreds of years to come back.
And strategically, the strange thing that seems to happen with that as well is geographically. I mean, you tend to have a kinship with people who are closest to you. Like, whether it's a localized kind of, we like the people down the road more so than the people on the other, island of New Zealand, or, we feel closer to the Australians and the Americans, or so to attack so harshly the eastern part of Ukraine, which I would imagine the further west you go, the less Russian it becomes, the more it gets into Europe. Therefore, basically the attacking, as you're saying, our literal or figurative brothers and sisters on the east seems to be a peculiar decision to make, as opposed to, I don't know if cruise missiles can go that far, but going for the western side of the country, which might be less aligned with Russian values, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is sort of in military and strategic terms, the West doesn't have a huge amount of value, but it's also and also it's just much closer, right? Like, you know, it's
Yeah.
there are a lot more Russian. There's a lot more Russian military installations, you know, and bases that have close ability to attack eastern Ukraine. They already have the separatist forces in eastern Ukraine that they've had. You know, there's 10,000 troops there, nothing to sort of sniff at. It's also the fact, though, that Vladimir Putin's whole idea was, well, we won't have to attack these cities. You know, they're Russian cities. As soon as we get there, there'll be a popular uprising that will kick out the Zelensky regime and welcome us as liberators. And it was just, and they were just apparently they were legitimately shocked when they got there to find that the cities were fighting back. And so that part of what's going on now, we think, is kind of a punishment bombardment, right? Well, there's two reasons for it, both equally horrible.
Wow.
One is that there's a punishment, you know, okay. The only thing I can really analogy I can think of it in my mind is kind of like the jealous ex-husband who kills his wife and her new partner. If I can't love you, no one else. If I can't have you, no one else can.
Yeah.
And the number two, which is equally chilling, is the idea that right now the Ukrainian army has a lot of really well defended, really well held positions, and they want to try and draw them out of those positions so that they can protect their own civilian population, but where they're a lot more vulnerable. So, you know, move troops out of their fortified locations on the Donbass line of contact or around Kiev to try and get them to go to Kharkiv and Mariupol and break those sieges, but make them a lot more vulnerable in the process. So they basically have a chance. Keep your defensive positions and keep your cities, or watch your civilians be like massacred. That's the kind of choice they're being given.
Often wars become winning hearts and minds and souls, you know. And obviously, what you've just told us about a brother phoning his sister in Russia, the hearts and souls of the Russian people haven't been won by Ukraine at the moment. They've been won by Putin's message. I see that Russia's banned Facebook and Instagram after labeling the parent company Meta an extremist organization. President Biden has recently called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. I'm interested in your opinion. What do you think would be the best way to get the message to the Russian people as what's really going on? Is there a way to cut through? Is there a way to get them that message, you know, around the Putin sort of media outlets?
Well, so you have to remember, it is still worth remembering that these are early days, right? Like this has only been, it feels, especially for me, it feels like this has been going on for years. It's only been going on it's 4 weeks today. It's been exactly 28 days. And a lot of what is going to happen in Russia, the domestic, you know, there's always a little bit of like, even in the most what conflicts that turned out to be the most unpopular, there is a bit of a rally around the flag effect at first, right? Like even the Iraq war was like popular when it started, even though it got much, much more unpopular as it dragged on. Yeah. And so, you know, you're going to have effects like, you know, sanctions are really going to start to bite. They're going to take a while, but they're going to bite in the next month or two. Sanctions are really going to start to bite. People are going to realize that actually they can't go abroad anymore, which, you know, might not have affected them now, but affects their future prospects of what they want to do with their children, their lives and their children's lives. They're going to realize how cut off they are. They're going to then the economic sanctions are going to bite. You know, there's going to be shortages in shops, and there's going to be, you know, all of these bad things that happen to the Russian domestic political situation. That is going to take time to filter through, but it will happen. Now, I know there's been some very, very interesting things that people have done. I remember there was like some organization, I wish I could remember the name, that was basically providing the cell phone number of just ordinary Russian people to, you know, on a big list, so that you could text them and say, hi, here's like videos of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. Wow. Telegram channels are still very popular. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger did that big, if anyone hasn't watched it, it's like just a persuasion masterclass of like 9 minutes where he talks about how much he loves Russia and then how much of what Russia's doing is terrible. That was circulated on a lot of Russian Telegram channels. Some Russian people still have VPNs. I'm still talking to, you know, people on Instagram and Facebook who have VPNs in Russia. So, you know, there are ways to do this, but it won't be an overnight thing.
The other thing I was wondering that kind of goes alongside what Russia is hearing is, you know, Russians, I read that 15,000 troops have died according to NATO, Russian troops. And also this story came out, I think, it's just a couple of hours ago. Russian journalist Oksana Bolina, killed in Kiev shelling. So she was in Kiev and she was reporting. And so Russian citizens, Russian journalists, Russian soldiers are all dying. I mean, is that also equally hard to filter that message through to the Russian people?
So I saw a really interesting, again, very, very chilling fact about this, is that apparently a lot of the Russian soldiers that are being used in Ukraine are sort of the Russian ethnic minorities from the eastern parts of the country. You know, we're talking about like Kazakhs and Uzbeks and people like that.
Yeah.
What they're trying is to see, from Moscow, St. Petersburg into the fighting as they possibly can at this point in time, just because, eventually, that's another thing that would take time to filter through. Eventually, all of these, families who are told your son is going on military exercise and he doesn't come home ever, they're going to figure that out. And there's the numbers are just so high. It's hard to say with any certitude, but it's at least 10,000. It's about what was killed in their war in Afghanistan over 10 years, and that had a domestic political impact, and that was strung out over 10 years. This is over a month. Yeah. It also just gives you a kind of an idea of just how intense this conflict is, right? This is way, 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 way more intense than anything than like Afghanistan or Iraq was, or anything like that.
You're 4 weeks in. You're going on a break off to Paris for a wee while. What do you know better today in Ukraine than you were not aware of on day one? What's more of a reality to you today than you didn't know on day one?
So that's the kind of thing, to give a good answer, I'll probably have to think about how I feel on the day out, because it's just been so kind of moment to moment. All right, bang, do this, story, file. As I keep on saying, the one thing I have been very impressed by is the sort of the way that the Ukrainians have sort of come together as a nation. It's almost a bit of a kind of a soppy bit of a Hollywood story about, this kind of underdog nation that really has come together around its people to fight this aggressive invader. But it is true in a matter of fact. And, it's been amazing to see just how people are legitimately committed to their to the defense of their homeland, and many people you meet genuinely say, I'm willing to die to defend my country. And I guess if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that for a lot of people there are things still, I know we say we're cynical in the modern world, but where there are still things that people find worth dying for. And remember that Putin has said effectively, and his messaging has been so bad, been so good at uniting Ukrainian people. He said, I don't believe Ukraine is a real country, and he's made it perfectly clear that if he wins his war, Ukraine will not exist ever again as a country. And the Ukrainian people have stood up and said, we will not accept this, and we're willing to die to protect and defend this. And I think that's quite a valuable thing.
So when you're actually out the door, when you're off to France?
I'm leaving today. I'm going to Poland today, and then I'll be flying out on Saturday.
And Are you flying from Lviv to Poland, or do you have to get across the border like in vehicles, or what happens?
You just get vehicles. It used to be huge queues, but they've massively gone down now. All of Ukrainian airspace is closed. There are no flights going in or out, or the only flights are fighter jets.
Right.
So, maybe I can hitch a ride on one of those on the way back. Let's see.
And there'll be no problems with you at the border. I mean, you're a man of fighting age. You just flash your New Zealand passport. I'm assuming you're traveling.
Also, I've got a press accreditation that allows you to move around the country pretty easily. So you just flash those out. You'll be.
Hey, Tom Mutch, Kiwi journalist in Ukraine. Thanks so much for being with us. A handful of times here in Big Hairy News. I really hope you have a good week off. I hope you can get some good sleep and find some big comfy beds with big soft pillows and drink lots of good coffee. Is the coffee good in Ukraine?
No, it's pretty rubbish, I'm afraid. Sorry, Ukrainian food, Ukrainian drinks, they haven't been the highlight of the trip, I'm afraid. Right.
Well, I'm sure you'll treat yourself once you get to Paris. Treat yourself like a god and have a good break. And I'll be watching your Twitter feed in Paris to see you under the Eiffel Tower having a bit of a break. But other than that, hopefully we'll talk again sometime in the future. Have a good break, and thanks so much for being a part of the show to this point.
No worries. I've enjoyed it.
To my mic back on, don't I? There you go, guys. We're all done for today. Thank you for participating. That was Tom Mutch live. It was pre-recorded, but we had him live from Ukraine. Thank you for being with us. This is 4 weeks we've been doing this now. Thank you for the people who have sort of become regular and contribute and watch and talk to us while we're doing it. We really appreciate it. We're trying to do something new here and set something up and see where we can go with it. So you handful of people who are joining in and enjoying our content, we appreciate you. Maybe next week it'll be 2 handfuls, and then in a month it'll be 10 handfuls, and then in a year it'll be 1 million handfuls. That's us for this week. Thanks for joining us. If you want to get in contact with us at any stage, you can do it through my personal website, which is just patbrittenden.com. You can also, best way to kind of find us is to follow us at the YouTube studio page, which is DOCNZ Studios. And that's where all the content is as well. You can also follow my personal social medias, which are down the bottom there, at Pat Brittenden, on Twitter especially, but Instagram as well. We put all the clips up on there, and then they're easy for you to share around should you feel so inclined to share them around. All right, guys. I think the Black Caps are playing today. Are the Black Caps playing today? Oh my God, I think they are. I might go put my feet up and watch the Black Caps playing. Talking of subscriptions in Sky Sport, that's another one. I've got a subscription to Spark Sport as well. God, I'm gonna go check my budget. I think cancel some of these things. All right, beautiful people. We'll see you Monday morning at 11 a.m. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great week and be safe. Hooroo, hooroo, hooroo.